and really excel if you want to succeed in this economy. And so I have been involved in a National Academy study that sought to understand what will the forces shaping future skills demand be, both through the US and other economies. One of the most interesting elements of this study on future skill demands was a chapter by a man named Stuart Elliott. And what he did was he looked at the trends in a wide range of technology areas: computers, artificial intelligence, robotics, optics. And he said, if we trace out the growth, the improvements in these technologies, how much of the work that we currently do, our college graduates, how much of that work could be performed by machines by the year 2030? And his conclusion was 60% of all of the jobs that are now done might be performed by machines by that time. So that raises really big issues for society in terms of what we will do in thinking about jobs and income distribution and how we transfer the gains of that huge increase in productivity. To give you an example of what we're talking about, if you think about agriculture, which still accounts for about 70% of the Indian workforce, in the US, we now feed all of our population and much of the rest of the world with under 3% of our workforce, because it has become so heavily automated and highly productive. Now, that did not result in mass unemployment. Instead, people found jobs in manufacturing and now increasingly in services. But the question will be, as we move this way, where will the new jobs be? How will they be generated? Where will the innovation come from? So what do we know about globalization? Well, the notion of offshoring, of movement of work to places like India or China, is not new. This has been happening in manufacturing for over a century. What is new is the shift of the highest end knowledge work to any location in the globe where people can find the best talent at the best price. And so what I have studied is the growth of this in areas like biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, IT. We see that a large number of jobs now have grown. This has been part of the huge success of India, but as a percentage of the overall US economy, it's still relatively small, under 1%. But it has been growing very rapidly. So I give you just one example, IBM, one of our leading corporations. IBM right now is firing tens of thousands of people in the US. As it grows, India's workforce now at 80,000, soon to be at 100,000. It's doing this because it says that India is a true center of excellence for it to serve global clients, because IBM is increasingly not a computer company, but a service company. And so it wants to have a talent base that can serve multinational companies anywhere in the world, and it has identified India as the place where it can most get the top talent at the best price to deliver that. And so you are seeing these shifts in the balance of that work within the company. Where I have studied, so if you looked in the 1990s, you saw that the US was really the only game in town when it came to biotech. We had almost all of the world's successful companies, we had most of the organizations, the number of US firms has not changed very much. We've added new firms and others have failed, while the Europe and Asia, particularly countries like India and China and Korea, have been expanding dramatically. So in India alone, we've identified 400 bioscience companies. Many of them, unlike the US, have figured out ways to get profitable very quickly. In the US, more than 90% of these firms fail before they ever get a product to market. In India, through a service model, they have figured out how to get profitable and then to add capabilities. Offshoring produces many benefits for both the US and for India, but it does it in a way where the consequences of it, when a major plant closes in the US because that work was moved to China or India, that gets a lot of attention. The gains are much harder to quantify, but they are many. A huge increase in wealth and living standards in developing nations, cheaper goods for all US consumers. There's direct job creation, new kinds of jobs like global supply chain integration, global project management that are created by this, but also indirect job creation. As India's middle class has now approached 250 to 300 million, as we see a similar thing in China, you're seeing a dramatic expansion of markets for US goods and US services like higher education. What's really interesting, and which we have found in our research, is when these models make possible things that never happened before. So to give you just one example, we studied a small biotech company located just near to Rutgers in New Jersey. It has about 200 employees in New Jersey, but it also employs 40 chemists and biologists here in India. It does that because it's trying to preserve its scarce cash. It's not yet got a drug on the market, but it's been very successful in raising venture capital, in raising grants. And so it's trying to make that money go as far as possible until its drugs prove to be successful. And so what it was doing before was, if it was only in the US, it say had $5 million to spend on research, they would prioritize all their projects, and they would say, we can afford to do these 10. Now with the operation in India, they do this prioritization. They say we can do these 10, but now because it costs us 1/4 as much, we can also do another 3 in India of projects that are very promising scientifically, but the market is not quite as big. So we wouldn't have done it otherwise, but now we can. And in one of these instances, the results were so promising from the work here that they wrote a grant to the NIH in the US. They got $13 million, and as a result, they had more employment in the US, more employment here in India, and a drug that might not have been discovered for another 10 years is now moving through the pipeline. And so that really is, I think, the best kinds of examples of a win-win all around. So to conclude, I'm going to focus on the project we're undertaking now, where I would really love your reactions and feedback. We're, as I said, comparing the skill creation systems of India and China. I'm doing this with a couple of colleagues, one at Cornell, Saroj, and Ming Wei, who is our newest faculty member at my school, who is an expert on labor issues in China. The real motivation for this project is that between the two, these countries account for about 1/3 of the global workforce in the 21st century. And so if we understand how they are providing skills for the majority of their population, not just the elite top 10%, but for the whole of the population, this could have a vital impact both in those countries, but also for other countries around the world. The framework, which I've already alluded to that we're using for this study, is the notion of the low skill equilibrium and the shift toward what I'm calling sustainable skill systems. And by sustainable, I mean two things. One, I mean green. I mean developing growth in ways that are adapted to the local context and in such a way that you achieve both growth, but also do it in a way that ideally is environmentally friendly. And secondly, I mean sustainable in terms of funding. Models that allow for all of the individuals who want skills to get them, but in such a way that different actors are contributing and that the system will be able to finance and continue over time. Historically in India, the low skill equilibrium was relatively stable up until the 1990s. Not many people went to higher education, but there was not so much of an issue with that because there actually weren't that many good jobs for graduates. There were government jobs, there were a few large conglomerates, and otherwise not that much demand. And so the supply of skills was relatively low, and the demand was relatively low. Well, all of that changed with globalization, with the opening of the economy. And what you see today, I think, is an unstable situation. Because you have an Indian population that sees the benefits of education. They understand that their ticket to success is being able to advance and get a good qualification. And yet for the large majority of the population, that opportunity is not yet open. The government system is not able to cope with that demand. And so we've seen a large growth in private provision at all levels of varying quality that is trying to meet this demand. And so I think India faces a huge challenge in trying to come up with a model fairly quickly because of the demographics of the country that will satisfy this demand or risk the whole of India's successful model being undermined because people will vote out governments that they don't believe are meeting their objectives. Able to provide universal basic education and ongoing development opportunities was resources. That there simply wasn't enough money to do this for such a large population. Well, as I've gathered data and looked at the research that's already been done, I'm increasingly convinced that this is not the case. That in fact, the problem is a systemic one. That if we can change the incentives, if we can change the institutions, And we leverage resources not just from the government, but from individuals and the private sector and NGOs. That in fact, there is the ability to meet this for all of the people in society. And if we can get the system right. And the key issue with that is not, do we have the right answers, but can we get them implemented? And so the framework we will be using for the project is to look at all of the different levels of the skills system, from basic education through to workforce development, and the different actors that are involved in the governance of the system, the delivery of it, as well as, next slide please, the finance of it. So where might the sources of finance come for the different levels? And one of the things that has interested me in the interviews and the research we've been doing is that this approach to when do we use public-private partnerships, when is it appropriate for the government to do it, when is it appropriate for others, seems to vary greatly from one segment to the other, one state to another, without a clear framework for understanding why are we doing it this way. That's what we hope to provide. So if you look at the comparison country, China, I think it provides a very interesting contrast with India. In China, you see a world leader in low-cost manufacturing, but not such great success in building its domestic service sector. And that manufacturing sector has really suffered in this current crisis because it is so heavily dependent on exports to survive. And so what the Chinese government is doing, much like the Indian government, is trying to move into more high-skill innovation sectors. They have built research universities at a rate that is unprecedented in human history to increase their supply of graduate labor. They have now declared that they will become, and I believe that they will be able to pull this off within a few years, the world leader in electric cars, because they are, in their huge cities, able to mobilize resources through the state to focus on this in a way that's much harder in a democracy like India or the US. And so they are investing both in the research and the infrastructure to do this, and then they will sell that model to the rest of the world. They are also, through the universities, investing very heavily in the kinds of sectors like research process outsourcing that India has done. And so, to give you one example, Wuxi Pharma in China is about to pass Pfizer this year as the largest employer of chemists in the world. Its business model, and the founder came from New Jersey, where he knew all of the executives in the large pharma companies, is quite simple. He says to them, we will do the same work you do in your labs in the US or Europe at a fraction of the cost, with talent that is roughly comparable. So give us more and more of your R&D dollars, and let us do that work for you. And that has been enabling their huge growth. We've gone pink all of a sudden. So here are some of the broad study questions that we have for China, things to think about. How do you provide skills and employment for the 80% of the Chinese population that are not going on to higher ed, particularly the very large migrant population that has moved from the rural areas to the cities, where their status, their eligibility of their children to go to school is not so good? Can a country become an innovation leader without having freedom of the press, without having free access to the internet, without having a democracy? This is an experiment that China is undertaking, which we have really never seen, other than in some aspects in the former Soviet Union. Can you achieve the aims they hope economically and not free up things politically and in civil society? That will be a very interesting challenge. Likewise, China has introduced major reforms on paper in things like unions and labor law and intellectual property. But so far the enforcement has not been so great. And so it will be interesting to see how these play out over time. And perhaps most interesting from a long-term perspective is, what will the consequences of China's one-child policy be? It puts them in a very, very different demographic position than India. In fact, this is the first nation in the world which is becoming old before it became rich. And so they will have a huge issue with supporting their welfare state and the number of workers relative to those who are no longer working within China, and will pose very interesting challenges, as well as for all of the parents out there in the room, right? This is known as the spoiled child generation, right? Because you have one child and you have two parents and four grandparents, and all of them are focused on that child's success. Right? And so it creates a very interesting dynamic, right? There's no ability to say, well, if you don't do it, then your brother or your sister will, right? Here it's all in one basket. And so this is a very interesting issue for China going forward. For India, I think we see very much the reverse situation. The question is, can India's success in high-end services be sustained? India has, in relative terms, a much weaker central state than you see in China, and so it has more difficulty in really mobilizing the resources for major investments in education or in infrastructure. And India has a different dynamic, not the restriction of democracy, but perhaps a democracy that works too well, right? Which has so much voting and voice and other things that if you do not meet the needs of that mass population, then those who are pursuing these policies to grow the country may not have a job going forward. You're already seeing some major supply-side constraints in India, particularly in towns like Hyderabad, Bangalore, others, where at least before the economic crisis, the demand for labor was leading to very high turnover rates, increasing wages, leading companies like Infosys to say, we can't afford to do this anymore in Bangalore, we're going to go to Paraguay to hire some of our programmers or call center workers. So the demand for labor has. We're also, like the US, seeing a growing gap between the educational haves, that rising middle class, and the have-nots in the system, which creates major societal issues. And so far, the government's solution to this has been to focus on the higher ed system and the reservation system to preserve places for those who are not benefiting. But this creates major issues because it does not address the root cause of the problem, which is that not everyone is being given an equal opportunity to really qualify for higher education at the school level. And it also, I think, raises challenges for India's higher education brand globally. So the start of the study is really poses what I call the skills paradox in India. How is it that a system where, if you look at the report of the National Knowledge Commission or Yashpal or other studies, a system which has major issues at every level of the system in how well it's performing, whether it's schools, vocational education, higher ed, how is it that a country with these skill issues has still managed to emerge as a leading world brand for talent at the high skill service end? And I think the solution is pretty simple. It's what I call the 3 E's. It's having the world's largest population, a rapidly growing under 25 population, and the 3 E's, namely an exam system that sorts that talent so that they get the very brightest going to the top universities. You have elite educational institutions like the one you're attending that do a good job of preparing that group. And then you have the English language, which is a major differentiator from China in terms of enabling that workforce to really compete in the global economy. India, besides these 3 E's, has many other skills assets. It has now built a very strong global brand. President Obama is referring to India's success in education and encouraging the US to emulate it. It has a commitment to a meritocracy, that we want the very brightest to be able to succeed. And also equity. We want to be inclusive and include people. And it is a democracy, which I think, while it can be messy, is the best system for encouraging innovation as we go forward into the knowledge economy. You also see, and this is a particularly important part of the project, individuals here and their families are very willing to invest in their own human capital, in their own development. And we have been visiting some schools, I will show you, here in the poorest parts of Hyderabad, where you see families living on very little, who are paying, without government subsidies, to send their kids to schools because they know this is the ticket to success. The same thing is happening in rural villages and cities throughout India. The government, likewise, has made a huge commitment to expanding the educational infrastructure. As you know, 4 times the increase in the budget in this 11th five-year plan. And you have a strong entrepreneurial culture, so it's not just giving people skills, but they're anxious to use it, to find ways to use this, to create new businesses, to make money. And a huge reservoir of global talent. So one of the other things that I think gives India a major competitive advantage is the fact that you have so many well-educated, experienced managers, scientists, engineers who are working around the world in leading global organizations. And when they look around now and they say, where are the biggest growth opportunities for the future, they're looking back to India. And that talent, the links, the networks they provide, will be a huge asset as India seeks to grow in the coming decade. But there is an equal, perhaps even more daunting set of skill challenges, which I'm sure you're aware of. Even the very poor, besides that the system is not working, even the very poor, people living on $2 a day or less, are paying to send their kids to private schools because the government schools are not working. You have a huge demand for skills in the country, and yet the vocational education sector is very small, only about 3% of the whole economy. And you've seen an explosion. 80% of the growth in higher ed has been in these new private, for-profit institutions, largely unregulated, that are offering a very different quality of higher education from what you all are experiencing. And the result is that about 80% of those graduates aren't able to find jobs in leading multinational corporations because they don't have the skills to get them. There's also a risk for the higher ed system, particularly with the very ambitious growth targets that the government has set. Where will you find the quality faculty and PhD students to fill all of these institutions if the salary structure, the rewards, the incentives for being a top performer are not made more flexible to enable them to attract them? You're also seeing, at the workforce development side, very low levels of investment in workforce development outside of the leading conglomerates and the government. In most of the economy, very little investment in ongoing development to keep pace with technological and global change. So just some data to back up these points, you probably find is quite disturbing, right? Even these least funded private schools, the ones I'm visiting here in the poorest parts of Hyderabad, on average are performing as well as the very best schools in the government sector. The majority of government schools are outperformed by all of the private schools. And so you have a system where most of the money is going into the lowest performing schools within the system. If you look at India compared not to the US or Germany or the UK, but you look at India compared to other developing countries, while India has made progress in terms of participation, it is still far, far behind its leading competitors. So India has only just over 20% of its population going to upper secondary education, far less than most of the other BRIC or other developing nations. The elite are benefiting, but the majority are still not getting that opportunity. When you look at vocational education,